"Sit down, Han. This isn't really your meeting." Warren Gildea said it without looking up from his phone. He was already reaching for his coffee, already half-turned toward the window, already done with her before she had taken off her coat. Celeste Ofosu set her bag on the chair beside the door, not the chair at the table. She had not been offered one, and stood very still for a moment, the way a person stands when they are deciding something. Then she sat down anyway, pulled the chair out slowly, set her notepad on the table, uncapped her pen. "Of course," she said. "Take your time. 43 years old, 16 years in infrastructure policy." The woman who had quietly redesigned the public transit framework for 3 provinces without her name appearing on a single press release. She wore the same navy blazer she had worn to every important meeting of her adult life because her mother had told her once that powerful rooms notice color before they notice sense. And she had decided long ago not to give powerful rooms any extra material. Gildea noticed none of that. What he noticed was that she had come in through the wrong door, the one the associates used, and that her coat was from a department store, and that she had the kind of face that blended into the background of photographs the way extra actors do. Useful. Forgettable. His. He had been running Gildea Transit Group for 22 years, long enough that the company had begun to resemble him. Aggressive, expensive, and privately contemptuous of anyone who could not sign a check large enough to matter. The federal contract on the table that morning was worth $410 million. 3 years of infrastructure work across northern Ontario and Manitoba. The kind of contract that did not come twice. Celeste had been invited to the meeting as a consultant. That was the word Gildea's assistant had used in the email. Consultant. The same word people use when they want expertise without the obligation of respect. She had read the contract the night before, all 212 pages of it. She had read it the way her mother had taught her to read anything that mattered, out loud, slowly, with a pencil in her hand, and a cup of tea going cold beside her. She had found 7 errors. 3 were clerical. 4 were structural, the kind that could void the agreement in arbitration, and had, in similar contracts, cost 2 other firms a combined total of $63 million in penalties. She did not say any of this when she sat down. She wrote the date at the top of her notepad and waited. There were 6 other people in the boardroom of the Gildea Transit Group's Toronto office. 2 senior associates, Gildea's legal counsel, a compact man named Renaud Cormier, who had the careful eyes of someone paid to read rooms as well as documents, and 3 representatives from the Federal Procurement Office who had flown in from Ottawa that morning and still had their lanyards on. Fletcher Maguire, the lead federal representative, was a quiet man in his mid-50s with the kind of stillness that comes from watching a great many meetings go wrong. He had reviewed Celeste's file before arriving. He had asked for her specifically. Gildea did not know that part yet. "Right," Gildea said, setting down his phone at last. He looked around the table and performed the particular kind of eye contact that powerful men perform, landing on everyone briefly and no one fully. "Let's keep this efficient. We've got a framework everyone's reviewed, Ottawa's happy with the timelines, and I'd like to be done before lunch." He did not look at Celeste. Fletcher Maguire looked at her once, a quick and deliberate glance, and then looked at his hands. The meeting began. Gildea narrated the contract the way a man narrates things he wrote himself, not explaining, performing. His 2 associates added numbers on cue. Legal counsel, the man Cormier, said almost nothing and watched almost everything. The Ottawa representatives nodded at the appropriate intervals. 20 minutes in, Gildea slid a signature page toward the center of the table. "I think we're good. Any final questions before we move to execution?" Celeste set down her pen. "Yes," she said. The room turned. Gildea's expression did not change, exactly, but something behind it did. The slight recalibration of a man who has forgotten a door was in the room and found it suddenly open. "Go ahead," he said, with the generous tone of a person granting an inconvenient favor. "Section 14, subsection C," Celeste said. The force majeure clause. The current language excludes labor disruptions that originate from municipal contractor decisions. In 3 of the 7 corridors listed in Schedule B, the subcontractors are municipal employees. Under this wording, if there's a municipal strike, which in Sudbury there is a collective agreement expiring in 4 months, the penalty structure in Section 22 kicks in automatically, regardless of cause. The federal party would owe Gildea Transit damages for delays they had no hand in creating. Silence. Not the silence of a room absorbing a small point, the silence of a room absorbing a large one. Renaud Cormier had gone very still. He had his copy of the contract open. He was looking at page 71. "That's a very creative reading," Gildea said. He smiled the way men smile when they want to suggest that a woman's concern is actually a compliment to her imagination. "Legal reviewed this thoroughly. I think you may have misread the—" "Section 31 also," Celeste said. "The dispute resolution pathway defaults to Ontario Superior Court. 2 of the Manitoba corridors fall under federal jurisdiction. Any dispute in those segments would need to go to federal court first, which creates a mandatory 6 to 9 month delay before any Ontario proceeding could begin. That doubles your exposure window if a dispute arises in years 2 or 3. Gildea set down his pen. Cormier turned to page 147. And, Celeste said, the Indigenous consultation records referenced in the appendix are dated from a preliminary environmental assessment in 2019. The 2023 amendments to the Impact Assessment Act require updated consultation documentation for projects of this scope that cross traditional territories. 3 of the corridors do. Without current documentation, the contract can be challenged and has been successfully in 2 comparable cases in the past 18 months. Fletcher Maguire opened his folder and removed a single page. He had brought it from Ottawa. He set it on the table face down and left it there. "Where did you study?" one of the Ottawa representatives asked. She was a young woman who had said nothing until now. "University of Manitoba," Celeste said. "Law. Then a master's in public policy at Dalhousie, then 16 years of contracts like this one." The young woman nodded slowly. "Like this one," Gildea repeated, with a particular edge. "And yet somehow I haven't seen your name on anything in this sector." Celeste looked at him evenly. "You wouldn't have. I work for the people who fix the problems before the name goes on anything." Cormier looked up from the contract. His expression had not changed, but something in it had settled, the way a scale settles when the weight is confirmed. "Mr. Gildea," he said quietly, "she's right on all 3 points. I need to speak with you before we proceed." Gildea laughed. It came out a half-second too loud. "Renaud, come on. We're not rewriting the contract over. Warren." Cormier said it gently, which made it worse. "I need to speak with you." The meeting paused. One of Gildea's associates refilled his water glass. A lanyard swung. From somewhere down the hall came the distant sound of a photocopier. Gildea pushed back his chair and followed his lawyer to the side of the room. They spoke in voices too low to carry. But the room could read the conversation in Gildea's posture, the set of his shoulders going from broad to close, the hand that came up once and then dropped. Fletcher Maguire turned to Celeste and said, in the quiet tone of a man confirming something he already knew, "You flagged all of this in your pre-meeting submission." "I sent it Thursday," she said. "I received it Thursday." He paused. Mr. Gildea's office was also copied. The room understood what that meant. The copy had not reached Gildea, or had reached him and not been read, or had been read and set aside by someone who had decided that a consultant named Celeste Ofosu, who came in through the associate's door in a navy blazer from a department store, was not the kind of person whose Thursday emails required a Friday response. Gildea came back to the table. His face was rearranged into something approaching professional. "All right. Renaud's flagged some language that apparently needs a second look," he said apparently. He managed to make it sound like a small concession to administrative tidiness rather than a structural error in a $400 million contract. We'll take a short recess. My team will pull the draft files and we'll reconvene at 2. He did not look at Celeste when he said it. But as people pushed back their chairs, as lanyards swung and associates checked phones, Fletcher Maguire flipped over the page he had brought from Ottawa and slid it across the table to her. It was a letter, federal letterhead, dated 6 weeks ago. It was an appointment, not a consultant's engagement, an appointment to a newly created position, Senior Policy Advisor, Infrastructure Contracts Review, with a mandate to assess federal transit agreements before execution. The salary was printed at the bottom. It was the kind of number that does not appear on contracts you are invited to observe. Celeste had drafted the terms of the position herself 18 months earlier, in a memo nobody above her had bothered to read. "We'd been looking for the right person for some time," Maguire said. He had the careful tone of someone who had personally ensured the right person was in this room today. "Your name came up repeatedly." She looked at the letter for a moment. Then she set it down. "Who else knows?" she asked. "In this room? Just me." He paused. "And Cormier." He was on the selection committee, which was why the lawyer's eyes had been so careful all morning. He had been watching a person he had helped choose walk into a room that did not know what she was. Before she could answer, Gildea returned from the window where he had been standing with his phone. He had reconvened himself in the way powerful men do, smoothing the jacket, lifting the chin, and he came back to the table with the expression of a man ready to offer something that costs him less than it appears. "Look," he said, pulling out his chair. He was talking to the room, but he was talking to Celeste. "We appreciate the sharp eyes. That's what consultants are for. We'll get the language sorted, have clean docs ready for signature next week. And," he paused for effect, the generous pause of a man about to say something magnanimous, "I'll have my office arrange a finder's fee for the flag. It's a reasonable gesture. A finder's fee." The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the silence of people who hadn't heard, but the silence of people deciding whether to acknowledge what they'd heard. The young Ottawa representative looked at her folder. One of Gildea's associates looked at his phone. Cormier looked at nothing. Celeste put the cap back on her pen. She did it slowly, the way her mother used to cap a pen after signing something important, a small final gesture. Then she stood up. She was not tall. She had never been tall. She had the build of a woman who had spent 20 years at desks and on public transit and in waiting rooms outside offices where people had kept her waiting. She wore no jewelry except her mother's ring, a thin gold band with a small garnet, which she had worn on her right hand since a Daisy died. "Mr. Gildea," she said, "I was not hired as a finder." She picked up the letter from the table, held it so he could see the letterhead. "My name is Celeste Ofosu. I have been appointed Senior Policy Advisor to the Federal Infrastructure Contracts Review. That appointment predates this meeting by 6 weeks. The mandate of the position includes the authority to recommend contract suspension pending compliance review." She set the letter down again. "I am not a consultant you can tip. I am the person who decides whether this contract proceeds." Gildea looked at the letter. He looked at Maguire. Maguire was looking at his hands. He looked at Cormier. Cormier was looking at his pen. Then he looked at Celeste. And something crossed his face that had not been there all morning. Not anger, not embarrassment exactly. Something older than those. The particular expression of a man who has spent 22 years reading rooms and has just understood, too late, that he misread this one from the moment she walked in. "The 3 issues I raised," Celeste said, "represent a combined liability exposure of between $60 and $90 million depending on timeline. That's not language. That's the contract. Your legal counsel knows this. He knew it before I spoke." She glanced once at Cormier, who did not look up. "The federal government's position is that no agreement will proceed to execution until those 3 sections are corrected. Independent Indigenous consultation is updated, and the documentation is reviewed by my office." She picked up her notepad. "My office will send a formal notice by end of day. You're welcome to have counsel review it." A pause, the small one her mother used to call the listening pause. I think you already know what it will say. She walked to the door, the same door she had come in through. At the threshold she stopped, not because she had forgotten anything, but because there was one more thing that needed to be said, and it belonged here, at the door, with the room still in its silence. I've been in rooms like this one for 16 years, she said. She was not talking to Gildea anymore. She was talking to the young Ottawa representative with the lanyard, to the associate who had looked at his phone, to the photocopier down the hall that had been running all morning. I was in rooms like this one before the legislation I helped draft made it possible for a contract like this to even be challenged. I have never once needed a chair to be offered to me. She looked at Gildea one last time. I bring my own. She left. The door did not slam. It closed the way doors close in old buildings, with a soft resistance and then a quiet click that carries further than it should. In the boardroom of the Gildea Transit Group, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Fletcher Maguire picked up his copy of the contract, squared it against the table, and slid it into his briefcase. We'll be in touch, he said to no one in particular. What happened next took 3 weeks, which is fast for government and slow for a man watching his company's largest contract renegotiated from the outside. Gildea's legal team rewrote the 3 sections. The Indigenous consultation documentation was restarted, the full process, the correct process, the one that should have been done in 2023. An independent firm reviewed the Manitoba corridors. The collective agreement in Sudbury, which did expire 4 months later, exactly as Celeste had said it would, was noted and the force majeure clause was rewritten to account for it. The contract was eventually signed. Gildea Transit Group was awarded the work, $410 million, same as it had always been. But the terms were different, and the liability that had been quietly embedded in the original document, the $60 to $90 million of exposure that a finder's fee would have papered over, was gone. None of Gildea's people ever mentioned the meeting. In the way of powerful organizations, it simply did not appear in the institutional memory. The revised contract was presented internally as a product of Gildea's thorough legal review process. Cormier, who had been on the committee that appointed Celeste, said nothing publicly and said everything privately when it mattered. Gildea called Maguire twice in the month that followed. Both calls were returned by an assistant. Celeste took the train back to Ottawa the same day. She had a window seat. Outside, the October landscape of northern Ontario moved past, spruce and rock and sky the color of old silver, and she sat with her notepad in her lap and thought about her mother. Celeste Ofosu had been a nurse for 31 years. Night shifts, mostly. The General Hospital in Winnipeg, then a smaller facility in Thunder Bay when the family moved north for her father's work. She had the hands of a woman who had spent 3 decades doing careful things in dim light, and she used them with a precision that was so complete, it looked like patience from the outside. She had raised Celeste on 2 things: the belief that expertise was the only currency that could not be devalued by someone else's opinion of you, and the habit of reading every document out loud, slowly with a pencil. People sign things they haven't read, a Daisy used to say, because they're afraid of looking slow. Read slow. Sign nothing until you understand it completely. She would tap the table with 1 finger for emphasis. The room will wait for you if what you know is worth waiting for. She had died of a stroke on a February morning 3 years before, in the same hospital where she had worked for 2 decades. The nurses on her ward had known her by name for years. The hospital administrator sent a form letter. Celeste still had the pencil from her mother's last document review, a discharge planning form she had helped a patient complete the week before she fell ill. It was a short yellow pencil, worn down to 4 inches, with a dull eraser that had gone hard from age. Celeste kept it in the front pocket of her bag, not as a relic, as a working tool. She had sharpened it twice. She had used it that morning, in a waiting room outside Gildea's boardroom, reading the contract one final time. The train moved north. The trees went by. In her notebook she had written, in her mother's handwriting, the loops and the straight-backed letters, the 7 errors she had found. They were still there. They were always going to have been there. That was the thing about documents. Errors existed whether or not someone found them. The only variable was who was in the room. 3 months later, the appointment was made public. The federal press release was 3 paragraphs. Celeste's name appeared in the second one. By then, she had reviewed 4 other contracts and flagged issues in 2. One of those was in British Columbia. One was in New Brunswick. Neither had gone to court. She gave one interview to a policy journal that nobody famous read. The journalist asked whether it felt meaningful to be the first person to hold the position. Celeste thought about it for a moment. "I'm not sure I'm the first," she said. "I think I'm the first one with the right paperwork." The journalist laughed. Celeste did not, quite. She was thinking of her mother, and of a form letter from a hospital administrator, and of all the rooms where expertise had walked in quietly and waited and eventually been necessary, with no record kept of the waiting. The garnet ring caught the light from the window. "My mother," she said, "used to say that the room will wait for you if what you know is worth waiting for." She paused. She was right. Rooms always wait. In the end, they just don't always know they're waiting. The interview ran 4 pages. It was the most read article in the journal's 40-year history. As for Warren Gildea, the contract was completed. The work was done. The trains ran on the corridors they were supposed to run, through the territories where the consultation had been properly completed, with the subcontractors protected by the clause that had been rewritten from scratch. He never sent the finder's fee. No one expected him to. He still runs Gildea Transit Group. The office is the same. The boardroom is the same. The chair at the far end of the table, the one Celeste had pulled out herself, has been reupholstered. He never changed the door. People who work for him say he reads contracts more carefully now, every page. Out loud sometimes, when he thinks the office is empty. His assistant has noticed it. She mentioned it once to a colleague in the coffee room, and they both agreed it was an odd habit for a man who had always prided himself on delegating the fine print. They are right that it is a habit. They are wrong that it is odd. It is the only sensible response to sitting across from someone who read the whole thing first. There is a photograph on the wall of Celeste's Ottawa office. Not a diploma. Not an award. A photograph of a park in Winnipeg. A picnic table, autumn leaves, a woman in scrubs with her hand raised against the sun, laughing at something outside the frame. Below it, on a small card she printed herself, is one line. Read slow. Sign nothing until you understand it completely. She brings her own chair. She always has. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Because somewhere in Canada right now, in a boardroom in Calgary, in a meeting room in Halifax, in a government office, in a city you know the name of, someone like Celeste Ofosu is being handed a chair that was never offered. Someone with 16 years of careful, invisible expertise is being called sweetheart or hon or consultant. Someone who read the whole document out loud with a pencil the night before is waiting for a room to catch up. And the question I want to leave you with is this. Think about the people in your life. Your mother, your father, the colleague nobody promotes, the neighbor nobody asks, the person who fixes things quietly and leaves before anyone notices. What do they know that the room has never thought to ask about? What expertise has been sitting at the wrong chair, or no chair at all, for longer than it should have? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that what they know is worth waiting for. Subscribe, because every week on The Silent Ruling, we tell the stories of the people the room forgot to watch. Right up until the moment the room had no choice.